Hello everybody, this particular blog, in photographs only this time, is at the rabbiting site near Royston in South Yorkshire. And for those who are familiar with the site, we took a different route this time. Usually we go from the car park down a little bit of the field and turn left towards the lakes. This morning we went down the car park to the footpath and turned right, and that led us down to a shorter walk, but it was hot, and that's what we did it for. And there's this particular area I can see now is looking across from where we were sitting towards I think it's a kind of a beck that's down there where the tree line is. And I think it may even run towards Carlton Marsh Nature Reserve. I've not checked up on that one yet, but if you do it, please let me know, and I'll take it further. Now the other thing on this particular photograph is that those electricity pylons were erected when I was a small boy. And so that gives you an indication of how old I am, 75, and how long those electrification pylons have been up. A few years ago they were painted at one side and they've not been painted since at the other side. But anyway, I digress. While we were on site, we met a lot of people, and one of these people we met was a young man who I think was doing some kind of a survey, and he'd been told about the site and didn't know about rabbiting. Excuse me while I have a drink. And he was marvelling how wonderful it was. So I thought, well, I'll ask him and see if he knows anything about what he's looking at, because that's what I do. I try to ask people what they're looking at, and if they can't tell me, I try and enlighten them, and then they often go way off their walk, enjoying their walk more than if they'd just been for a walk around. So what my wife said to this young man was that the area itself was often air polluted. Now, it's not all that long since the pollution had gone. And what we had was a pit, the Moncton pit, and also the Moncton coking plant. And the pit, of course, supplied coal for all fires. Everything was at one point coal. There was no gas fires. When I got married, it was still coal. And also, the coking plant used to sometimes let off a smell across Royston. It depended where the wind was blowing, and there's pollution from that and pollution from the coal-fired household coal fires and industry as well. In fact, the college I worked at was once powered by coal. But all these factors put together created lots of smog type situations depending on the weather, and we tried to explain this to this young man, because on the day that we were out walking, and you can see that for yourself, it was a lovely clear day, and you can see the tree tops in the in the distance, you would not have been able to see those treetops had the area still have been all coal. The light quality would have been much different. So what we tried to do was explain to this young man how the air quality had changed. And he did listen, but because it was a young man, he couldn't comprehend. So I'll try and explain better this time. Now this particular shot is looking at the slag heap as it is now. 2 or 3 years ago there was, you wouldn't have seen any trees on there at all. But I was trying to explain about the quality of air. My wife and I, when we were younger, used to drive down to Cornwall, Carby's Bay, and 2 or 3 days into the holiday we would sneeze, and when we sneezed, soot came down our noses, and that seems incredible to think that that's true, but it is a fact, and that goes to prove how poor the quality of air was in the area we lived. But we accepted that lot because we'd always known it to be that kind of air. In fact, on a foggy night, you could smell it, but we accepted it. We grew up with it, and that's how it was. This young man couldn't understand what we was talking about. He thought we were talking about was the soot coming from the tin mines in Cornwall, and I realised later that it's such an hard thing to comprehend that air was so bad over here. On this particular shot, again looking over to the stack or slag heap or landscaping heap, whatever you want to call it now, you can see that the trees are starting to mature, and you can see also an area where they've all been fenced in. Anyway, we tried to talk to this young man again and explain how bad the air was in this area, because, as I said earlier, it's so clear now I couldn't comprehend it. So we stuck at that a while, and then he said something like, "That's incredible. Who could have thought that it could have been like that?" And when I think back, I think, yeah, he's right. It was incredible. Everything was coal-fired, and the more coal we put on the fire, the worse the environment became. Now this area, landscape area, is also a football ground now, football field now, sorry, and you can see all the grasses around it. But the young man I've just referred to began to ask questions about the mining and miners, and I explained that there was no buses at that time, and if you went on a 6 o'clock start, you may have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to get to work. Indeed, I did that, but I have to say to you all that I didn't stop at the pit more than a few weeks. It wasn't for me, and I take my hat off to the people who could stick it out. They are my heroes. And we also went into explaining to people, this young man, that miners, we used to get bathed in a tin bath in front of the fire, no pit baths then. Some of them didn't used to wash their spines because the skin, if it wasn't washed, hardened up, as they thought, and by constantly bashing against the coal seams with their spines, their skin tore, and so they thought by not washing it there, it hardened the skin up. And also, all miners that had been down the pit and had an accident were left with a blue scar because the coal was still underneath the skin. And we were telling him all this stuff we took for granted and were amazed he didn't know about it. For some reason, which I'll not go into, miners were often demonized and said to be lazy. And in fact, while we were down Cornwall, one man took an issue with me because I said I came from South Yorkshire in the mining area, and I had to hold my tongue so that I didn't spoil my manners on my holiday, because the man was so entrenched in the idea that everyone that came from a mining area was a shirker. Now, I can assure you that people that worked down the pit were very hard-working people, and if you want to go and look at a pit area, there's still one or two you can go and visit, open to the public. You'll see for yourself that the working conditions were horrendous, and of course you'd also got to walk to the seam that was being worked at that time. And then of course they had the seams became so further away that they had to ride on special vehicles to get to work. Now when they were picking, shoveling, and they had pit props and things like that, the props had to be grown and from trees, and the trees I mentioned in one of the vlogs were all planted close together so that they grew straight and then could be used as props. I will mention that at some point when I go to Charles Waterton area at Rye Hill, Winterset, and I'll try, if I can remember that is, to point out some of the areas that were planted just for pit props. And getting back to demonizing, there was vast profits in coal, and the people or investors made a lot of money out of it, and they could only do that because of the railway. Pits were usually in areas that were out in the middle of nowhere, and the coal had to be moved. And at first, of course, men used to go down and make their own bell pits and take coal out for themselves and their family. And then, of course, when it became more commercialized and businessmen became involved, the pits were sunk down shafts, and it became harder and harder to get coal off the surface, so they went further down, 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 and the coal was mined that way. And of course, then when it was the commercial thing and it was sent abroad, in fact Germany all had their own coal, but the coal from England went to different countries because there was a different calorific value on some of the coals. In other words, some coals burnt to an higher temperature than others, and the coal that we use at home, I suspect, was different to coals that were used in industry. But the railways came in, and there is still remnants of the railways today of where the coal went and came from. In fact, when I went to work at the pit, I was going to work as a engine driver, moving coal from the pit to other areas, local areas that is. And that didn't materialize. What I did, I was working in the engine house, and in the Royston pit then was a a drift mine, and instead of going down in a shaft straight down, it sort of drifted into the pit. I never went down, so I can't tell you enough about that. But I drove the engine, and this took goods down the pit, and it also took people down the pit. And so you had to be very careful how you descended the craft into the pit. Okay, I'm not the right person to speak about the conditions of the pit and how the pit worked. There's people out there with far more knowledge than I have. But if you are interested in such things, the history of the pits and how the men and women actually who had to scrub all the clothing and put up with it all, and who sometimes had to go to the pit head after there'd been an accident and wait there and hope that their loved one came out of the pit alive. They were as much involved with the pits as their husbands. And because pits were in areas which I've mentioned out in the middle of nowhere sometimes, before buses and before trains, it was very difficult to move somewhere else other than, I think even the Roman centurions only walked 20 miles in a day, 10 mile out and 10 mile back. So it would be very difficult for people who worked in a mining area to know anything that was going off around them. In fact, people once thought that birds, as an example, who we now know come into the country and go out of the country, people used to think when birds went from their areas, they went into other villages in other parts of the country. And so it was a society that was cut off. And because it was cut off, it had a community of its own. And one of the strong points was the people of the community policed the troublemakers, and they were severely dealt with not by vicious ways, but because everybody knew everybody else. People used to say, "I can see what you're doing. I'll be at the pit on Monday, and I'll be telling your father that you were doing what you were doing." And father would come home from the pit, and he would give his son or daughter what for. And so that was a way of self-policing, and it worked very well actually. But also shops in the village where I live in did very well out of the miners because they couldn't go nowhere, and groceries. There was a clock shop. There was a shoe shop, and haberdasheries, places where you could buy anything you wanted for your home, carpet shops. I'm not so sure about carpet shops at that point because there wouldn't be many people had carpets. But anything you wanted, you could get it in the village. Of course, all the shops shut down when the pit shut. A knock-on effect is still with us today, all those years on. And but I was fortunate. I retrained and I finished up working in my local college as a technician. And I know a lot of ex-miners retrained and they went to do all sorts of things. One of my friends used to go to London all week, to work in London all week, and travel home at the weekends because there was no work round here at all to be had. Or once the pit shut, everything else that supplied to the pit, like ironworks and stuff like that, they all shut down as well. So the shop shut down, the suppliers shut down, the pit shut down, and men, women and children were all affected. Of course, the working conditions were such that men were often broken men by the time they came to retire, although things did get slightly better later as time went on. But there was a lot of men that never got to reach their retirement because of lung diseases. Excuse me, I'm burping. Lung diseases and broken bodies. People just cannot comprehend how bad it was when they've never lived in a mining community. People who'd worked in offices all day saying that miners were lazy, had it cushy really, and we're not starting work well 8:30 in the morning for the starters was a bonus. And as I said earlier, there was no you often had to walk to work, and so you had to get up extra early. And 4 o'clock, I go to 4 o'clock to get to work in the past, and it is a long day. And of course, you have to walk it back home again. So there were long shifts, and afternoon shifts and night shifts as well. Fortunately, no Sunday workings at that time. Today, we hear about things like people are not getting enough vitamin D in their diets. Well, if you think about the mining community, miners went down underground and they never saw daylight until they came out again. And so they used to go walking when it was possible. And it was one of the things about mining that people became more aware of what was going on around them with birds and nature and fishing and all sorts of hobbies that meant being out in the open. And you can well imagine, can't you, having to go off holiday if you got one, where it had been sunny and you've been out walking in the sun, and then come Monday morning you got to go down in the depths, in the bowels of the earth, into complete darkness. It must have been a really depressing thing. But on that note, I am pleased to say that the rabbiting site is now there for everybody to go and walk around because it's been landscaped, and it's a nice site, and there's several walks on there, and I have yet to go on them all. And there's such a lot to see if you know what to look for, and I hope I've been able to give you an insight into some of the things that you can see when you're out walking on rabbitings, in particular on this video. Bye for now.